RME. It is sometime in March. And today, before the show, I finished reading Albert Camus's The Stranger, La Strane, which I believe is a pronunciation of French, which I have not looked at French in years, so I could be completely wrong. I really read this over the course of about 2 days. I read it mostly between the two shows that we did yesterday, and then I finished it up before the show today, which means that I have ran an entire show and then had to sit for a while afterwards before recording this, so I will probably be not fully explaining myself the way that I want to. Also, my cat has finally decided that she wants to be doing stuff now, so that's all that. But The Stranger, right? Albert Camus is a French philosopher who, my understanding, deals a lot with like morality and things like that, right? And The Stranger is meant to represent, it is like this kind of absurd piece, right? It's absurdism in a different way, right? Because the big one that I could the other big absurdist kind of writer that I can think of is Kafka. And I think that there's this really big difference between these two things, right? In which, like, absurdist pieces to me in both Kafka as well as postmodern pieces and whatnot, the absurdism comes from what is happening to the character, right? And it is the character is a normal person, and then things happen to them that are absurd, right? And therefore it becomes the plot that is absurd. Versus The Stranger, which is like the absurdism is that the narrator themselves is absurd, right? And it's not that our character has, like, quote unquote no morals, because like morality in of itself is having no morals is generally just the concept of having a morality that is considered opposite or in direct contrast to what would be standard morality, right? Think Oscar Wilde, right? And Victorian values and things, right? Versus The Stranger, which our character is that he doesn't have any value. It's not that he has no values. It's that there is no morality to speak of, right? And that's what's absurd about it, right? Is that you are working with and trying to read the thoughts of a character where it's like it is their first time ever experiencing the world, and just having any thoughts whatsoever. And it's this very, very strange feeling in a lot of these ways, right? Which, right, it's absurdism this way, right? Of that this is a character that has no concept of morality, right? And so, like, the decisions that get made and the way that things get described are just this kind of insane, it's almost animal primitive like, right? And it's this very, very strange thing, right? So yeah, like it's a fascinating thing, right? Which I think that also calls into question the title of, who is the stranger, right? The obvious pick there would be as they describe, the Arab man who our narrator kills, right? What's the name of our narrator? I keep I don't know, but it is this, the stranger. I would normally be just the Arab man that our narrator ends up killing. But really, I could also argue that the stranger is our narrator themselves, because it is this experiencing the world through a complete stranger, right? And that they have no concept of the same type of life or ideas that we would normally associate with Western civilization, and the way that Western countries tend to be raised, right? It's very, 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 it's strange feeling. Yeah, yeah, yeah. The second part of the absurdism comes from, right, it becomes the narrator feeling that they have no control over anything, right? Our narrator eventually we kind of figure out that our narrator is completely obsessed with the constant feelings of the present, right? And has no real feelings or thoughts or concepts towards what will happen in the future, nor what has happened in the past, right? Everything is about what is happening currently in the immediate. And so, like, when asked why he killed the guy, eventually he proclaims that it was the sun. And reading that chapter, it's him being upset about how the sun is making him feel, and that has somehow driven him to kill a man, right? The same thing goes for when attending his mother's funeral, in which he shows no signs of even being interested in what is happening, right? It is that he is living constantly within the present, and in order to feel sadness or feel remorse for things, you must remember the past. And because he refuses to, the funeral occurs, and all he can think about is how miserable the day is and how hot it is. And yeah, just this kind of strange feeling. But all that kind of ties into, right? This book has probably the most famous opening line, and probably also one of the most famous examples of, like, the importance of good translations and, like, the difficulties of translation, right? Because there is so much cultural association or ideology that exists within a language, right? And to properly translate that takes a great deal of work, right? I don't know the original French opening, but I can tell you that the translation by Matthew Ward, who's the translator for this piece, and I think this is probably the most common translation now, but the line at a deadpan note is mother died today, right? That would be the deadpan direct literal translation. But that's not really what it says, right? In the French, it uses a kind of childlike maman. It's this kind of childish word that gets used, and it's a question of how do you properly treat that, because not only does it get used here, but then it gets used constantly throughout the piece and throughout the book. And so how does one properly give that the correct connotation, right? because it's not just mama either. Oh, it's a very, very specific cultural context that exists with it. And so what Matthew Ward ends up doing, as well as what I think a lot of translators end up doing, is just not translating the word. The word throughout the entire piece is always maman, right? And it feels in some ways like this kind of like, I don't know, you figure it out kind of deal, but it's also very much like knowing this whole process and knowing like this is what's like, these are the situations that it comes into about how do we translate things properly, is very much an, oh, I get the gist of what is being given here, but also that there's a much, much deeper personal feeling that really can't be properly articulated, right? And you know, the reason that becomes important is really because of this. It immediately frames our narrator as being childlike in a way, right? Which then also helps frame this whole concept of him experiencing the world effectively for the first time and experiencing morality for the first time, of where, because he has lived and thought in such a way that everything is about the immediate present, the morality that he gets put to is strange for him and makes no sense, and the way that people treat him doesn't make any sense, because he just wants to be able to explain everything and go, it does not matter what happens because it has already happened. And it's just not the worldview that other people are looking for, right? So yeah. I would say the final thing with this book is kind of an interesting take that our narrator has at the end, which is very much seems to be just Albert Camus talking to the reader. But it is this concept of execution. Our narrator ends up being sentenced to execution by guillotine. And it becomes a take on the death penalty, where the argument basically becomes that the person being executed also becomes complicit in making the execution happen, right? And basically the argument becomes that our narrator once would love to live in a world where executions work 90% of the time, and 10% of the time the execution happens, but the person doesn't die, and the person gets released and gets to go back into the world, right? And to our narrator, that seems like a fair deal, right? And then he compares it to the way it actually exists, right? Of the guillotine, or with the guaranteed death, right? And the thought is that, right, sentencing someone to death by guillotine is a guaranteed death, right? There is no, even if it miraculously failed, right, that was not the intent, right? And therefore the guillotine will be raised again and dropped again. And so to avoid that pain and avoid that struggle, it becomes in the person being executed, it becomes in their best interest to also be executed on the first try, right? And it becomes a thing that they also wish for. And in doing so, they become just as complicit in wanting it as the audience as the quote-unquote state of France and the countrymen of France, because that becomes a whole other argument as well that our narrator puts in there, right? But it's just a very, very interesting way to think about desire and morality and wanting something, right? And in wanting something, even if it harms us, right? To what extent can we become complicit by wanting things, right? So, yeah, I mean, fascinating little read. I certainly should have read this a lot quicker, but it just got broken up by running shows and things. So that's that. That is The Stranger by Albert Camus.